Hi, my name is Charmaine Campbell-Patton, and I am a current chair of the Use and Influence Topical Interest Group, or TIG, from the American Evaluation Association. And right now it's February 2026. And one of the things that our topical interest group is interested in doing this year is to really document the history as one of the oldest TIGs in AEA of learning where we've come and how we've gotten to where we are now. So, we're going to be having a series of conversations with some of our thought leaders, elders, and founding members to hear how the TIG got started and how it's evolved over the past several decades. So, our first conversation is a special one for me because it's with my father, Michael Quinn Patton, who is a well known leader in the field of evaluation. He's written 5 editions of utilization focused evaluation, the last of which I co authored with him. And that book, along with many of his other books and writings and speeches and YouTube videos, have had a significant influence on the field generally, but also how evaluation use is understood, promoted, supported, and evaluated. So, for this conversation, we're going to hear some history from Michael about this TIG and some of the major issues that it has grappled with over the past years. So, Michael, what do you think we should know as folks who are coming into the field and who are trying to carry on the legacy of evaluation use and influence?
It's great that you all are doing this, that we don't lose our history. The American Evaluation Association was formed out of the merger of the Evaluation Network and the Evaluation Research Society in the mid-1980s. And by then, the American Evaluation Association had become big enough that there was a felt need to have a way for people with common interests to find each other. And so that self-organizing came about by recommending issues that people might want to come together on. And we decided that use was one of those issues, that the field was going to in part be determined by how evaluations were used. And so we ought to pull together a group to focus on that. And we were among the first TIGs that were ever formed. And in the early days, we're helping prepare, as we still do, the selection of sessions at the American Evaluation Association. And a lot of the early TIG meetings were really initially conceptual. What kinds of uses there were, distinguishing types of uses, and the very first American Evaluation Association conference after the merger in 1987, Bob Covert was president. The theme of that meeting was the utilization of evaluation. And the TIG was a co-sponsor of the sessions that Carol Weiss did and that I did. We each did plenary presentations on the use of evaluation, and that was the focus of that session. And the TIG was involved in helping organize that. And then we got involved in distinguishing use from misuse and non-use and influence and symbolic use, enlightenment use. And so a lot of the early work was figuring out what kinds of uses and what the range of uses were. And then at the 10-year mark, the Use TIG sponsored a survey of AEA members on their views of use. It was either the master's thesis or the dissertation. I think it was the master's thesis for one of the graduate students, and but it was overseen by Hallie Preskel and Valerie Caroselli, 1997, and it was a survey of TIG members. So it wasn't all of AEA. We surveyed TIG members 85% rated as extremely or greatly important, identifying and prioritizing intended users of the evaluation. And 80% said that evaluators should take responsibility for involving stakeholders in evaluation processes. And there was a follow-up survey then 10 years later. That's when Fleischner did her master's thesis. So we did a survey of the membership in 1997 and repeated that survey for a master's degree study in 2007, at which point 98% agreed with the assertion that evaluations should be user-focused. Another survey sponsored by the TIG was with Brad Cousins and Lynn Shula, and that focused on process use, and which I introduced in the third edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation in 1997. And the TIG ended up sponsoring, under Brad's editorship, a new directions for evaluation on process use that had articles by mostly TIG members that were invited. And so the TIG oversaw that. And we've continued to have presentations by people on special issues as they've emerged, including when Marv Alkin did the theory tree. One of the branches was the use branch. So the theory tree has 3 branches: methods, values, and use. And part of the TIG sessions were devoted to what should be on the use branch and how that has expanded and grown. And then the social justice branch got added to the theory tree. We had Marv Alkin and Tina Christie were active members of the TIG, and so we had sessions devoted to those developments. Mel Mark and Gary Henry came up with a model of use. They presented it to TIG. So there were ongoing developments around use that continued to give the vitality to the TIG, and it remains one of the largest topical interest groups, was the largest in the beginning, and has remained one of the largest at AEA, where there are now some 50 topical interest groups.
Thank you for sharing the history and the different ways that we've, as a TIG, kind of come together to understand what's happening with use and influence. And you mentioned the tree, but I know you also are a big proponent of cross-fertilization and not over-siloing things. So how do you see this TIG in connection with some of the other developments in the field, and how has that evolved from your perspective?
It's a great question, and part of the challenge is that in some ways, what every other TIG does ultimately depends upon use. So, data visualization is a form of use. What kind of data you gather is a matter of use. Then there are TIGs based upon position, philanthropic TIG, and the extension service TIG, and the government human services TIG. And so people in the nonprofit sector and a consultants TIG, and all of those have use issues. So part of that has been that when you do sessions, you can have more than one TIG sponsor for a session to encourage cross-fertilization. We have over the years shared some speaking sessions with other TIGs, theory-driven evaluation. We did a session with them about how theory-driven evaluation was used. Data visualization has had a use component. So there is that cross-fertilization that the difficulty with AEA being so large, is one of scheduling, because the TIG meetings tend to be scheduled at the same time, the business meetings and the sessions and the uh, coffee hour or the reception. And so there is the challenge of being able to cross-fertilize because things are happening at the same time.
Sure. And I know we'll be talking with Karen Kirkhart next week, who has been very influential in this TIG, particularly in adding influence to the use side. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that, what you remember about when that happened, and whether that was rooted in some critique of the TIG or just an expansion, or how that came to be from your perspective.
Well, the language has always been something that we debate and continue to debate. The latest iteration is replacing the word stakeholders with interest holders. Um, our original substitution, I mean, the standards that came out in 79, the first iteration of the standards used the word audiences for evaluation. And the TIG, when they did the revision of the standards, they do a revision every 10 years. As an organization that has standards, there is an organization for standards that requires you to do a review every 10 years. And so in that first review, we got them to change the language based upon utilization focused evaluation from audiences to intended users. Um, and so we moved from stakeholders to intended users. Now the language is interest holders and intended users. Gene King and I had a TIG session early on where she advocated for the word use instead of utilization. And my position was that utilization captured more the process nature of use. Use sounded like a distinct thing, but as a elementary school teacher and person who likes simple language, Gene held out for the word use. Influence then got added as a long-standing consideration that intended use by intended users was overly instrumental. And that influence side was really a formalization of Carol Weiss's contributions that in the 1978 AEA, where both of us did plenaries, Carol's and what became the Weiss-Patton debate turned out that Carol Weiss was operating at the federal level with Congress and policymakers where you don't get direct use. It's not like you do a study and it gets converted. It's a policy process, incremental enlightenment, takes multiple studies, and doesn't happen very quickly. So evaluation is appropriately more influential than used. Whereas I was working with local foundations, with local nonprofits, often with just one or two interest holders and intended users, where you could actually get concrete use. You could do something formatively, developmentally, and you're working with the users and they could use it and make a difference. So influence had as much to do with understanding that the nature of use is different at different scales in different contexts. You don't get with legislative kind of bodies direct use, but if you're working with a small nonprofit, you can get intended use by intended users. And that's helped us become more sophisticated about the landscape of levels and kinds of use. And what amounted to the Weiss-Patton debate was a realization that we were operating at different levels with different intended user kinds of groups, where the processes of use were quite dramatically different degrees of control, different kind of decision-making context.
Now, you mentioned the debate, and I know that you've participated in many debates over the years, and that is something that you would like to see more of happening now. Are there any other debates you want to remind us about or talk about the value that you see in that mode of communication?
The one of the debates that emerged from the work on realist evaluation that Mel Mark and Gary Henry did a book on with George Julnas, um, argued that use was the wrong criterion to judge evaluations. They made the case that evaluations should be judged by whether they contributed to social betterment. And that became a debate because I argued that you can't get to social betterment unless it's used. So social betterment was simply a further out criterion of use. You still had to have use to get to social betterment. So in the Hawaii um, AEA in the year 2000, the TIG sponsored a plenary debate between Gary Henry and myself on social betterment versus use. And that was another um, distinction that emerged that was more about it being sure that use was leading to some kind of um, improvement in the world. Um, a version of that was championed by Tom Schwandt, who we've just lost here in December, but Tom's contribution along this line was distinguishing between asking the question, are we doing things right? Which means, is the program effective? Is it accomplishing what it wants to? Versus, are we doing the right things? And that's the issue of what values inform what constitutes social betterment. So the critique of a pure use point of view is that if you help improve the efficiency of doing harm to people, the efficiency, let's say, of bank foreclosures of poor people, or the classic example that's used is make uh, the killing of people in a genocide more efficient, that's use, but it's not appropriate use. That you have to have a value base for social betterment that says your kind of use is doing the right thing, not just doing things right. So that's been a stream about how much use needs to be guided. And of course, part of what you brought to our fifth edition, and one of the ways that the fifth edition of utilization focused is evaluation is different, is making explicit our value commitments to sustainability and equity as doing the right things, not just having things used regardless. And that tension is a part of what has been discussed often at the TIG.
Absolutely. How does that in your mind connect with misuse, or what has been the conversation around misuse? And I know you're also looking at non-use now in terms of getting rid of evaluation functions altogether. But what would you say about those beyond kind of use and influence to misuse and non-use?
In the very first edition of utilization focused evaluation in 1978 was a short section on use versus misuse with the hypothesis back then. I mean, we were concerned that not much evaluation was getting used. And so the book was about how to change that. And that gave rise to utilization focused evaluation. But the hypothesis in that book, which is proven true, was that as use went up, misuse would also go up. Because if people are paying more attention and evaluation begins to be more important and part of the policy making discussion, then people would start to manipulate the data, cherry pick the data. And what we're seeing now is simply misinformation, disinformation, lies, distortions of data in a mammoth level. And part of what drives that is that we've increased the attention to data. Data has become more important in the policymaking world. And so trying to get the data appropriately used runs up against the distortions, the fake news, the lies, and that has grown geometrically in recent years under the Trump administration. So um, what we haven't systematically done is track misuse. We've done them, our studies have been largely of use rather than of misuse. Um, Non-use is pretty straightforward because from the beginning, we knew what the factors were that led to people not using evaluation. But the impetus for use is pretty great these days, and that has led to much greater misuse. We don't have as much sophistication about categorizing types of misuse, factors related to misuse, as we do about the positive side. And that's one of the agendas I think we need to look at going forward is how to better understand and make sense of kinds, degrees, and factors related to misuse.
Well, that's a great segue into like what would you like to see come out of the TIG and the field around use and influence in the next few years?
Um, the obvious one that everybody's on top of and you're working with as well is how does artificial intelligence affect all of this? And part of the basic issue there already is whether AI has been used, how to tell. It's getting to the place where, I mean, we're having this conversation just after the 2026 Super Bowl. And in watching the Super Bowl commercials, the constant question was, how much of that was AI? Um, and sometimes you can tell, and sometimes you can't. And the disclosure requirements around AI, what are the expectations and what levels of disclosure? Um, and so and then there's also the issue of the people running the AI um, platforms and software um, are expropriating people's work, like our books, to include in their domains of things that they're drawing from for AI. So the whole field of what's knowledge and copyright and ownership and authorship and AI is hugely developing. That's going to be a big issue going forward. Uh, and I think that this issue of how misuse gets corrected, well, I mean, there's mammoth um, data checking now that goes on and fact checking. There are organizations that do that. And that's become increasingly important. And in some ways, I mean, I've written several pieces saying all evaluators have to be fact checkers. It's part of what we have to do because there's so much distortion out there. But how we do it and when we decide to take a position as an organization on distortion of information, that becomes one of the issues. I think it's getting increasingly hard where there's so much distortion. How do you prioritize what to go after? And uh, that becomes an issue for us as a policy-making world.
Well, as we close out, what else do you want the incoming generation to know or remember? What would you like to leave them with?
Um, Not to take use for granted, and to appreciate our position from the beginning, which I think is still the case, is that ultimately the future of the profession of evaluation depends upon use. Um, Use is our value proposition, that we have something to offer, that we can do something that makes a difference. And unless that's the case, to the extent that the nature of evaluation becomes simply compliance, and the big challenge um, of use is that it's meaningful use, it's significant use, that it's use that matters. Um, I've just completed a review of Tom Schwant's career contributions and his main concern about evaluation over the life of his scholarship, which really comes to the fore now, is that so much of evaluation in institutions has become routine, has become compliance, has become checklists, has become filling out forms and writing reports, and it's just routine kind of work, not thoughtful, not meaningful, not deep dives, not making a difference. And what we know is that use doesn't happen naturally. It requires facilitation, it requires a plan, it requires follow through. And so for new and emerging evaluators, use, how to do it, how to work with intended users, and how to take responsibility for it is what continues to be the overall agenda, because the default increasingly is going through the motions of evaluation, but it not really making a difference. And it takes extra work and commitment that ought to be built into our work and our contracts and our professional obligations and standards and principles, is that we care about, work at, commit to, and develop skills around enhancing meaningful and significant and appropriate use.
A great reminder. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and to our TIG and for all that you've done for the field and for your support of use and influence. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you and others as we go forward.
My greetings to all. Wish I could be with you as you discuss these issues. And we'll look forward to seeing people at the next AEA.
Thank you.